Good morning, everyone. It's 10:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Mary Elizabeth Fukai, and I'm filling in for Brittany Branyan, who is currently out on maternity leave. Welcome to the Carey Center Nonprofit Affiliate Program's second virtual presentation of 2021, Hands On Nashville, Resiliency in 2020. If you're unfamiliar with the Nonprofit Affiliate Program, we foster a community of educators, professionals, organizations, and students who have a desire to embody philanthropy, nonprofit studies, and leadership in their professional and personal lives. And we do this in part by providing professional development and networking opportunities, as well as these educational programs to our members and the community at large. During today's program, we're going to learn about Hands On Nashville and the work that they do in the Nashville area. The city of Nashville saw devastating tornadoes, a pandemic, and a suicide bomb all within the last year. And Hands On Nashville found ways to serve their city in partnership with their community through crisis after crisis. Today's speaker, Lindsey Turner, serves as Director of Communications for Hands On Nashville. Lindsey joined the Hands On Nashville team in 2018 after spending more than 13 years in the newspaper industry as an art director, designer, copy editor, and writer. In her role with Hands On Nashville, Lindsey drives content strategy, marketing strategy, social media strategy, media relations, and she designs the bulk of the agency's printed and digital collateral. Lindsey enjoys making and selling art in her free time, and she has 2 novels she dreams of finishing someday. She shares that she lives with her husband, son, and 2 dogs in a perpetual state of disarray. Lindsey, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to see some new faces, even if it is distantly and remotely, but I'm happy to be here. So thank you guys for joining. I really do mean a perpetual state of disarray, as you can see behind me. I'm not even going to put up a background because this is how we live now. So thank you for your grace. I've been with Han since 2018. For those of you who aren't super familiar with the agency, I figure what I'll do is give you some background on who we are, what we do, and talk a little bit about 2020. And honestly, as I was thinking about, putting this presentation together, I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to talk about for 45 minutes? That sounds way too long for anything I would have to say. And then I started taking notes and I realized, oh wow, 2020 was so full of so much stuff. 45 minutes may not be a lot. So, or may not be enough. So I'm going to try to meter out what I'm talking about. I want you guys to please feel free to jump in with questions in the chat if you have them. I'm not going to look at chat because I'm highly distractible by chat, I have learned this past year, but feel free to put those in there, and Mary Elizabeth will ask them when the time comes. Hands On Nashville is a volunteer resource center. That's the most simple explanation of what we are. We are part of the Points of Light Global Network, which, if you guys are familiar with Hands On Birmingham or Hands On, River Region, I think, around Montgomery, those organizations are also part of the Points of Light Global Network. We are loosely affiliated, which means that there's no, we don't all do things the same way. So the way Hands On River Region functions and what their services are going to be totally different from Hands On Nashville's functions and services, but united by the principle of serving your neighbors, essentially. So Hands On Nashville was founded in 1991. That was pre-internet. That was back in the day when the founder, Hal Cato, he heard of a group in Atlanta that was doing, I think he was doing Meals on Wheels on his lunch hours. And he heard of a group in Atlanta that was cultivating this culture of volunteerism. And he went down there and learned what they were doing and said, let's do this in Nashville. And that group ended up becoming Hands On Atlanta, which was the sort of pioneer of the Hands On network. And then so in Nashville, Hal founded Hands On Nashville to do many of the same things. And he and his tiny unpaid team, they would call up nonprofits all over the city, say, what could volunteers help you do? And then he would take that information and they would literally type it up, print it out, paste it up, and scan copies and put copies of these flyers in people's mailboxes. And now, of course, the internet has happened, social media has happened. We have lightning fast ways to get those needs out to the community, but it's just amazing to think that that's how this started. It all started by one guy who was like, how can we get this information to the people who want to help and they just don't know where to start? So as a volunteer resource center now in 2021, what we do is we work to build capacity for organizations and individuals to meet needs through service. And what that looks like is we have more than 200 local community partners. That's nonprofits, civic agencies, government departments, schools. Those partners recruit volunteers and manage them using our website. And we help them sort of shape their volunteer programming, especially smaller organizations that are just getting started. We help them reimagine what volunteers can do to help them. And, you know, thinking about the future, you know, how can volunteers help you now, but how could they maybe help you in the future in ways that maybe they're not thinking about? We have a handful of programs that are all centered around volunteers or long-term service in some way. We have a corporate engagement program where we work with businesses to create custom volunteer projects that they do in partnership with local nonprofit agencies. We'll do placements. So we'll either match make or we'll create a totally custom volunteer project for that group. So a lot of companies are doing team building. A lot of companies are trying to give back to the community and they want real hands-on ways of doing that. And so our corporate engagement team comes up with some creative ways for big groups of employees to go into a nonprofit and do a really transformational day of change type things. We have a program called Geek Cause, which is a skilled tech volunteerism program. And what that does is nonprofits perennially have tech issues where, you know, a lot of nonprofits are small and scrappy and don't have a lot of budget for tech support or, you know, tech management, and they'll have a problem that's really bugging them and they don't know how to solve it. And so Geek Cause engages really techie volunteers who know all about, you know, app development, website management, data security, all of these things that, like, you know, blows the mind of people who don't do those things. We can recruit those volunteers, match them with the organizations and help them knock out those problems so that they can meet their missions more efficiently and save their sanity, which is very important in nonprofit work. We also administer the Hands On Nashville AmeriCorps program, where we place AmeriCorps members for year-long terms at local agencies. Year-long terms of service. These members get a living stipend and an education award and professional development training, and they spend a year at a local agency helping build their capacity to meet needs. And they build programs and partnerships and really help take that agency to the next level. So we have 23 AmeriCorps members placed right now, and in August we will place 30. So we're really excited. That program is growing really fast. So I could go on and on, but essentially all of our programs and services are centered around service and finding ways for people to give back through volunteering. One big piece of the Hands On Nashville pie that is the whole reason why we're talking today is disaster response. So Hands On Nashville is named in Nashville's Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan as the partner for volunteer activation and management in times of disaster. And what that means is when a disaster hits, to the degree that volunteers can help with immediate response or long-term recovery, Hands On Nashville manages that and offers support to other community organizations already on the ground. And so I'll start by telling you a story about blue skies and gray skies. So in 2019 was a blue sky year in Nashville. There were cranes in the air downtown, building buildings, tourists everywhere, locals getting annoyed with tourists. Like it was a time of growth. And so Hands On Nashville was looking at this growth and thinking, that's all great. However, volunteer numbers are not growing along with that population growth. And we wanted to know why. We were also going into 2020, which was going to be the 10th anniversary of the historic Nashville flood from May 2010. And if you're not familiar with that, Nashville had, I think it was a 1,000-year flood that completely just inundated downtown and lots of neighborhoods, cut people off from resources, just ruined thousands of houses. People died, businesses closed. It was a massive, massive disaster. And Hands On Nashville played a really important part in the recovery from that disaster. Volunteers showed up to sandbag, distribute food and water, help muck out houses so that people could start the process of rebuilding. I believe it was at 21,000 volunteers. Here I am without the number in my brain. It was something like 21,000 volunteers, contributed 91,000 hours to flood recovery. And that's just on HON-led projects. We also referred another 125,000 volunteers to other organizations. So 2010 was a huge year for disaster response. And 2010 to 2020 was pretty quiet in terms of big disasters in Nashville. So we were going into 2020 thinking, all right, it's been 10 years since the flood. We know we want to commemorate this in a big way because volunteers were such a big part of the story. But also we want to try to reignite that sense of community, because the story of the flood was the flood itself and the horrible tragedy of it, but it was also the massive uprising of people coming together and helping each other out. That was almost as much of a story as the flood itself. So we were thinking, all right, we want to do something that will re-engage people, reignite that heart for service. So let's have this month-long initiative bookended by opening up with our annual volunteer recognition awards called the Strobel Awards, and ending with Hands On Nashville Day, which was our annual day of service where volunteers would go out all over the city and do transformational projects in one day. And in between then, we'll engage 10,000 volunteers to mark 10 years. And then March 3rd hit. So we were scheduling that for April, starting in the month of April. So that was our idea. And part of what we were hoping to do from that big initiative was establish the Hands On Nashville Disaster Activation Fund, because we are part of Nashville's Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, but it's an unfunded mandate. And so those of you who are familiar with nonprofit work will know that unfunded mandates are important, but also everything that is important needs funding. So we were hoping by doing this big event, we could reignite the spirit of volunteerism. We could begin this disaster activation fund and then move into really building out a good emergency response plan that we knew we needed and was part of our strategic plan, but had never really been fleshed out to the degree that it was usable. So we thought, all right, 2020 is our year. We're going to make this our focus. We're going to really do this. We're going to put some money behind it. And then March happened. So on March 3rd, Middle Tennessee was hit by a series of tornadoes. I believe the strongest was an F4. The one that came through Nashville, I think, was an F3. I woke up that morning. It was Super Tuesday. I'll never forget because I hadn't voted yet. That night, we had gone to bed, and it had been storming. We knew that it was stormy. I took my husband, woke him up and took him and our dogs to the basement. My son was luckily at his dad's house, which is further away from the tornado path than we were. So we went down to the basement. The storm passed. I think it knocked over our garbage can. We came back upstairs. There was no news about it yet. We went to sleep. It was sometime after midnight. When I got up around 5 or 5:30 and started looking at my phone, then I realized, something very bad has happened. So we realized with horror that the tornado had come about a mile south of our house. It cut a completely horizontal path through the county, almost completely horizontal. And I was starting to realize, my friends, my family, all of these feelings and emotions about the thing and what had happened. So I start texting, I start getting texts. And then it dawns on me when my boss texts me that not only are we dealing with, sort of a personal issue, because I still hadn't heard back from some of my friends who I know were directly in the path, but also now Hands On Nashville is officially activated. Like, we had to switch over into disaster mode um, without a plan. so, um, so once that sort of, and it took a little bit of time for that to sort of register in my head, which is, a whole thing. So I got dressed, this was right before COVID. So we were still going to the office. I got dressed. I went to vote. Luckily, my voting precinct is really close to my house. I voted really quick, and then I drove to the office. And what was normally a 15-minute commute took me 2 hours, because every place I tried to go, trees down, police blocking the way, live wires down. It was just a total mess. And so I finally made it to the office, and our team had to figure out, it was a totally different world that morning than it had been any day before that day. We realized, because Hands On Nashville is in the position we're in, the news and others who were reputable began to say, go to Hands On Nashville to volunteer. Well, we didn't have anything for people to volunteer for yet, but people were coming to our website. So our website started crashing. Our CEO was working with the mayor and the Office of Emergency Management to figure out, you can't just send people out in a disaster. There's a whole time period where officials have to go out and look at the areas and make sure that they're clear for volunteers. You can't just officially send people out when there's live wires or gas leaks, or when emergency vehicles need to be able to get in and out of places. So we were working with the city, trying to figure out what was appropriate for volunteers to do. We realized we needed to be messaging in the interim, because people wanted to know, how can I help? And people don't want to hear, well, you can't help right now. But we had to message that. We were inundated with phone calls, with emails. I think a news reporter had published my personal email address in a story. So I was getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails. I could not keep up. And so our team very quickly realized we had to stop and think, okay, how are we going to do this? We don't have a plan in place. We have a loose idea of what it is we need to accomplish, but how to get there was not clear to us at that time. And of course, the irony of, but we were trying to plan began to dawn on us, and that felt really weird. So here we were, inventing the wheel while building our car to get where we needed to go. So after a tornado, what you see, and I'm sure this is it for a lot of natural disasters, people just want to get out and help. They don't want to wait to be told what to do. If they see a tree down, they're going to go and move it. And so acknowledging that and understanding that that is human nature, for people to want to get out and help, we realized very quickly that not only is that happening, but there's also already grassroots organizations on the ground in the affected neighborhoods who are starting to organize in a much more quick and nimble way than we could, because we were organizing in collaboration with the city, which moves at its own pace. They have a lot of considerations to think about, and them signing off on any plan to send volunteers into unsafe areas would not bode well for anybody. So we realized, we really need to figure out how best our organization can support the organizations already on the ground doing the work, because we don't ever want to be in a situation where we assume that we're the experts and that we have to lead from the front. We know that there is leading from behind. We know that we have a support role, and we know that the people on the ground in those neighborhoods know way more than we do about the idiosyncrasies of that neighborhood and what is needed. So we very quickly realized that we have two roles, at least in a disaster situation, where we will be leading some projects in collaboration with the city and through official channels. And then we will be providing support for those who are already doing that kind of work. The question was, what kind of support did they need? And so our team sort of had to evolve really quickly to understand that we needed to get people out there to do reconnaissance work pretty quickly. And so we engaged volunteer leaders in the form of AmeriCorps members. So all of those at the time, I think that cohort may have been 19 people. Those 19 AmeriCorps members, as part of their service agreement, they have a disaster clause that if a disaster hits and Hands On Nashville needs to activate you as a volunteer or volunteer leader, that's what you do. So we had those people, we had some community volunteer leaders, we had friends and family, we had people who we trusted to send out and find out what is it that these groups on the ground need, and how can we help? So it was a lot of figuring that kind of thing out on the fly. What we realized, well, we didn't really realize it, we knew it, but we saw it in action sort of for the first time, is that any areas where we had not effectively built partnerships in certain areas of town or with certain churches or neighborhood groups, any places where we didn't have an existing strong relationship, suddenly there was a really bad time to start trying to build a really good organic relationship and assume trust there. You know, you need to have the trust built before you come in and say, I'm here to help. And then, you know, they may not want your help, you know, like because when you work with the city as sort of an official collaborator with the city, you're no longer like a small grassroots scrappy organization, you're the man, you know. So like people didn't want the man to come in and tell them what to do, they wanted support. And in some cases they didn't even want that much support, they had it under control, in which case all good, we can go support somewhere else. So I think that, you know, figuring out how to pivot in real time was a challenge for us because we had so many different people doing so many different things, and there were so many different neighborhoods affected that had vastly different needs. And so it took a lot of really intentional work to figure out and it took some mistakes too. You know, we did not, I think, realize in our haste to get people out there, some of these volunteer leaders needed more context and understanding of what it is they were going to do, and what their backup plan should be if the thing they went to do ended up not being possible. So we've used a lot of the lessons from that to do better planning for, you know, disaster volunteer leadership training, which we're working on now, and that sort of thing. So it was kind of a blur. For about 2 weeks, it was tornado, tornado, tornado. We were in the office, in close quarters. We heard something about COVID, but we were, you know, full speed ahead on tornado recovery. And then we kept hearing about COVID, and then suddenly COVID was in Middle Tennessee in Williamson County, which is a county south of us. And then we realized, okay, this is happening too. How on earth could we possibly think about social distancing and that sort of thing? So we brought in hand sanitizer. We tried to really outfit the room that we were in for, you know, hygiene and sanitation. And then I just remember March 16th being the last normal day, I think, of the year. And then when COVID hit Middle Tennessee, we started working from home, and tornado recovery kind of ground to a halt because there was a safer at home order. And suddenly now it was less about going out and cleaning up after a tornado and more about, okay, well, schools are out. How can we get food to the children on the lunch program who don't have food at home? How can we get food to their families? How can we, you know, support testing? So the city once again said, okay, we need your help. And so we got a second activation for COVID. And they said, we need help recruiting volunteers for the COVID-19 informational call centers. They needed volunteers to help at the community assessment centers where they were doing COVID testing. They needed volunteers to help at the temporary homeless shelters that were erected at the fairgrounds to help those experiencing homelessness, stay socially distant, but also have a place to stay. And so we had to start thinking, okay, well, how can we engage volunteers in sort of risky environments, asking someone to come and um, be in an environment where people who think they have COVID are getting tested is not a small ask for a volunteer. But we had to ask it, and people showed up, and people kept showing up. There was a core group of people who volunteered at the community assessment centers day after day after day. And it was a lot of volunteers were coming because they had gotten laid off or furloughed and they suddenly had extra time. So we had to work with our community partners to really understand what they were doing, and were they still having operations? Were they still engaging volunteers? How could we make sure that they were limiting group sizes and enforcing social distancing and masks and PPE? Because we knew that people were scared. People needed to know that if they were going to take the risk and show up to volunteer, that they were going to be in a safe environment. And because we are not directly in control of those kinds of volunteer opportunities, we couldn't guarantee that. We just had to really work with our partners to really encourage it. And then we added, on our volunteer feedback forms, specific questions about safety, so that if there were volunteers who were in an environment that they felt was not safe, they could tell us, and then we could handle that with a partner. So we really did have to pivot very quickly to that. And every time I talk about this, the only thing I can compare it to is whiplash, because we were full speed ahead, and it was just thousands and thousands, 26,000 people signed up to help after the tornado in 1 week after the tornado, which is way more than even the number of people who helped after the flood in a year. So all of this energy that people wanted to help, and suddenly we had to slam the brakes on and say, actually, Nashville, you need to stay home for safety. So it really was walking a tricky line between heeding that safer at home order and also continuing to ask people to come out to volunteer to meet critical needs, because we knew that as the pandemic went on, the needs weren't going to shrink. They were going to get more and more. As more people lost jobs, as more people couldn't, afford food, the food bank lists were growing, that sort of thing. And when that list grows, their volunteer needs grow as well. So we spent the summer trying to deal with COVID and get volunteers to support COVID relief efforts as much as possible. We had really hoped that the last half of the year would be about, creating a runway to make sure that we had those needs met. But we saw volunteer participation drop off because people don't want to volunteer in a pandemic, which is totally understandable. But some people do want to help still. So we had to find the people who still felt like they could help, or wanted to help, and help them find ways to help that met their comfort level. So we did a survey to try to gauge people's attitudes about volunteering in a pandemic, to try to see, would you be comfortable going to a project with 25 people? What about 10 people? What about if it was outdoors? What about, just different scenarios to kind of see where people's comfort level was. And we shared that information with our partners so that they could shape their volunteer opportunities and figure out, okay, if we're going to ask volunteers to show up, here's how we can do that most safely. And I think that was pretty successful. But it's definitely been an ongoing thing to try to, keep up with the evolutions of, Nashville has gone in and out of different phases of our reopening. And so just reacting to that has been a challenge. We had really hoped to sort of end the year really focusing on our disaster planning, knowing that we were in disasters, but also you can't pause planning for that. Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? And so we went into the end of the year with a really exciting opportunity. The city reached out and asked us to help recruit volunteers for the COVID vaccination clinics. And so the health department's vaccination clinic opened on December 23rd. And I volunteered that day. I wanted to see what it was like, and I wanted to just kind of be part of that moment. And it was really like, that was the first moment of the year where it was like, okay, this feels like a corner to be turned. This is a really hopeful day. It was first responders and healthcare workers getting vaccinated. And I'm even getting emotional talking about it. It was just really, really nice to see the relief, and just everybody was so excited. Oh, yeah. So there's still emotion loaded there. And so we thought, okay, well, 2020, you've been a real bear, but you're almost out of here. And so on Christmas Day, I was lying in bed. It also happens to be my birthday, which was fun. I was lying in bed and I heard this boom, and I thought, okay, that's weird. Maybe that's a transformer exploding. So of course I get on Twitter just to kind of see, and I start seeing videos and photos coming out of downtown, where people don't know exactly what it is, but they know it is an explosion. And Second Avenue, which is a really beautiful historic area of downtown, was just demolished. And so as the story starts coming out, even before people fully understood what had happened, we were starting to get messages. How can we help? How can we help? How can volunteers help? And so I was just like amazed that there was anybody left in Nashville who would raise their hand to help out again after all that people had been doing all year. So then details started to come out about what had actually happened, and the fact that it was a man who probably did it intentionally. And so it was one of those just really unfortunate. It just felt like an extra kick in the pants, just on the way out, like a parting shot from 2020. That's how I felt personally. I'm sure others felt that way too. But then seeing people raise their hands to say, I want to help, what can I do to help with cleanup or whatever, was just like, balm for the soul. So that particular thing ended up being, because it was a man-made disaster and not a natural disaster, it was a little more challenging to have some straightforward ways volunteers could help with the cleanup, because the FBI was down there. It was a crime scene. So they kept the area blocked off for a long time. It was not a good place for volunteers to come in until much later. And then on a very limited basis, where volunteers were helping residents and business owners move their stuff out of their apartments and businesses. And then volunteers were also helping offsite, collecting donations, putting together food and hygiene kits for the survivors and that sort of thing, which is also something that volunteers had been doing for COVID affected folks and for tornado survivors too. So volunteers, while certainly the volume of volunteers was less because of the pandemic, there is a core of people in this city, and I imagine in every city, who were just constantly re-energized to come and keep helping. And it was identifying those people and making sure that we were getting the right messages to them that really became the focus of the last half of our year, and has really become a really good pillar of our content strategy going forward. Is like, we have tools to know who's the most engaged people, who's opening our newsletters, who's landing on our website, that kind of thing. How can we make sure that we are talking to those people and keeping them engaged and energized? So that's sort of the trajectory of the things that happened. As those external things were happening, our team was also working really hard on some culture work internally. We restructured. Our strategic plan that we had expired in 2020. In 2021. So no, 2020. So we were building a new strategic plan for the next 3 years. So we had, and a disaster emergency response plan for the future that could work in many different scenarios. So we had all of these different things happening internally that had to be informed by the external things that were happening. For example, we realized when the tornado hit that I mentioned this earlier, that the partnerships we had were strong, but we needed more strong partnerships in more places with more people, and to certainly diversify the partnerships, and make sure that the recruitment that we were doing with volunteers and partners, that we were being more intentional about finding new audiences. We've been talking to our same audience for a long time. How can we find new audiences? So building a strategic plan and a team around that understanding became a whole thing. So I've talked a lot. I think that, the things that our team has really worked hard to do, knowing that this is a year of, we haven't been in the office together in almost an entire year now. We had to learn how to be a remote workforce. We had to learn how to give everybody grace with the things that they were dealing with. We had 2 team members who, one on her second day with us is when the tornado hit, and it hit her apartment building and she lost her home. So she was dealing with that and the trauma from that. We had another team member whose neighborhood was demolished in the tornado, but her house and a couple of other houses stood, and her house became like a headquarters for volunteers and other things. And she started leading volunteers immediately. So she had that to deal with. I have a child at home. We're doing virtual school. There's other parents on the team. So everybody was bringing their own hurts and trauma from the year to their own experience. And so we really had to work hard to build in time and space and understanding of that. I think if it was just dealing with a pandemic, it would still be, there would still need to be space for people to be able to grieve and mourn and that sort of thing. So it really became a lot about making sure that we were being intentional about building that time to talk about things for people who wanted to talk about them, but also this space and understanding from managers to, manage the individual and their individual situation. We're a pretty touchy-feely bunch in terms of like, most of us don't mind to talk about our emotions, but not everybody is that way. So for the ones who don't really want to, do confession about their emotions to feel better, how could they still get the same sort of time and grace that you would need to keep doing this work, but also take care of yourself? So that's been a big part of, I think, how we have made it through, encouraging everybody to ask for help when they need it, and really meaning that, not just saying that, but really meaning that, and having structures to provide that help has been big. And then the willingness to be vulnerable and tell people, when we don't exactly know what the right thing is, and asking for help and asking for feedback, even when it might be difficult to hear. Doing that personally, but also as an organization. And I think we're going to be doing more of that going forward. And then being willing to experiment and just try things. For example, when I onboarded in 2018, my sort of instruction was, our newsletters are short and sweet. They come out every other week. And I think feeling behind it was, we don't want to bug people too much. But now we realized that, when the tornado hit, we started sending out a newsletter every week because the opportunities were changing that quickly. And we needed to just be able to be responsive to the pace. But we realized that the more information, the more useful stuff, the more good storytelling we put in there, and with that frequency of every week, our newsletter subscriber list grew by about 20,000, and our open rate doubled. So, less is not always more. So that has been a fun experiment to do. So I just think it's been quite a year. 2021, I think, we're not in blue skies yet. We're still in gray skies for COVID, and medium gray skies. There's still tornado recovery happening, but less and less involves volunteers at this point. 2021 is a year of planning, hopefully, but we also understand there's no such thing as when we get back to normal. Like, we have to just assume that there will always be more than just planning happening at any time. So setting our own expectations about that has been important. Okay, I've talked so much. Thank you all. I'm happy to answer questions, or if there's anything that's on y'all's mind, I would love to hear about, y'all's experience in 2020. I've been so focused on Nashville's disasters. What local things have happened that y'all are dealing with that might be similar or totally different? Any and all of that.
I have a statistics question for you, which might be unfair. Well, the first one should be easy. How many full-time or part-time paid employees does Hands On Nashville have?
Mm-hmm. We have 15 full-time paid employees and 5 AmeriCorps members who are not technically employees, but they do get a living stipend. But they are very generous with their time, because a living stipend is a stipend. So we are 20 people strong most of the time. Occasionally we will have interns, and we've been trying to engage volunteers more. I mean, which you would think would be like a duh for us, but sometimes it's a lot easier to talk about it than it is to do it. So we're really trying to engage more volunteers. In fact, that's the only way that we got through the tornado was our brilliant director of partnerships was like, we can't do all this by ourselves. We need help. And so she brought in some of her own friends just to help us with administrative work, answering calls, replying to emails, even replying to social media direct messages, because we were just total.
The harder, more difficult question, with those 20 people, about how many volunteers, I know it changes year to year, but how many external volunteers are you dealing with? I know you had like 26,000, sign up for the first day, but what would you say on a typical year?
On a typical year, I want to say that 2019, I think we had 21,000 volunteer signups. So it's so funny because I think on a disaster but non-pandemic year, it was still higher last year than that, but I just can't even imagine how high it would be if the pandemic hadn't, depressed that number. But I think a typical year is probably around 20,000 individual signups. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. And yeah, last year it was 52,000 people signed up to serve 52,000 times, and it was more than 7,000 projects on our calendar. Now, some of those 52,000 may have signed up multiple times. So one thing that's really hard about what we do and the technology that we use is that sometimes it's really hard to pinpoint the exact number of volunteers, because our system, people sign up to go volunteer, but we don't require that partners report attendance. So some partners do and some partners don't. A lot of partners feel like that's like, that's a whole other step that's like a hardship for them. So we often have to talk about sort of estimates of numbers of hours served and that sort of thing, because we can't personally verify every single one, unfortunately.
Sure.
And the other thing about disaster volunteerism is that the number that we have is the number of people who went to our website, created an account, and signed up that way. We cannot account for the numbers of people who were just out there giving their time and never did a sign up sheet or logged in. So I imagine that it is really, really undercounted, but there's just it's a difficult thing to capture those numbers in a disaster. But we're working on figuring out ways to better capture that, and I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow. That's incredible. It's incredible. We have a question about the 2020 impact report on your website, and how interns might apply. as we do have several college students on with us today.
Absolutely. So interns can, let me think about this. I don't know that we have any intern postings live right now, but I imagine that we will in, getting closer to summer. I would say if you have an interest in working with us, I can share my email address. I'd love for you to shoot me a note about that so that I can get an idea of like what you're interested in doing, and maybe send your information to the department where that would make most sense. I'm hopeful that we'll have some internship postings actually live in a couple of months. So yeah, I'm happy to, let me put my email in the chat. You guys are welcome to email me and ask questions or send me resumes or whatever. I'm happy to do that. Was there a specific question about the impact report?
No.
Okay. I'm really excited. That's the first one that we've done, and I'm really excited about it. So any excuse to talk about the impact report, I'm here for it.
That's what they're saying, that just to whatever you wanted to share about it.
Oh, okay. So in my time, and I don't know that it was ever done years and years ago, and that's kind of that's the thing about joining an organization, is that if that organization has not done a really good job of presenting their history, you kind of feel like, okay, well, I don't exactly know if they did this before. It doesn't look like it. So here we go. I'll just do it this way. So I don't think that we've ever done that before. I know our CEO really has wanted one since she's been with the organization, and I think she's been there 5 years. So we just wanted to, we do all this stuff and we do all this different stuff, and we've never really put it all together in that kind of format. And we knew that we were going to be evolving our key messaging and website copy, and we had all this new disaster information, and we just knew that we wanted to share all of the stuff that people had done all year in an easy to see format with some numbers in it. So I'm excited about having a baseline for the impact report to build upon next year. So yeah, it's just a way to sort of talk about our programs holistically and get the headlines out there, because truly there's so many different things that our organization is doing that it can be really hard to talk about them in the aggregate without a helpful tool like that. So I'm hopeful that it's useful.
Cool, awesome. Well, it's already being noticed. So, Alicia had a question for you.
Yes, thank you. Are you hearing me well?
I hear you, Alicia.
Okay, good. I am in the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics, and Hospitality Management. I teach on the hospitality management side, and I like to think of the hospitality tourism industry as first responders as well whenever there are disasters. And there's just numerous occasions where we've seen this happen in communities, and the restaurant industry, the hotel industry respond. And I was curious as to what that was like with your organization, if you work with the hospitality industry, or if you have special programs, for instance, outside of having a disaster or having that special need. If there are programs for people who travel to Nashville, and let's say they're staying at the Omni, and they may want to, as part of their trip, be involved in a volunteer capacity, if that's something that your organization does facilitate, or that you have programs with hotels that are similar to that.
We don't at this time, except for probably the closest thing would be the corporate partner program, but that would be more about if Marriott, the company, wanted to engage their employees in volunteer service, we would help them do that. But I have been thinking a lot about, what are the different avenues for engaging those new audiences of volunteers. And one of them is, there's the new Nashvillians who have just moved here, but then there's also the tourists and people who are just visiting. And so certainly I think, and in fact, a really specific example of that is bachelorettes, which we have a ton, like Nashville is bachelorette town. And so, or I mean, obviously like not now, but in normal times. So I've been thinking, okay, well, what's some content that we could put out there that could pitch volunteerism as a great bachelorette or bachelor party activity? So already thinking along those lines of, you know, if people are just here for a couple of days, how could they, you know, what could be their little Nashville passport, and how could volunteering be part of it? So I think that's a really good, that's a good avenue for finding people. And part of my job I take very seriously is, how can I figure out what story to tell those different audiences? It's going to make them take that action. So I think that's a really good idea, and I'm going to steal it. Thank you very much. I'll give you credit.
That's awesome. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.
We have a question about what advice you would give to aspiring nonprofit professionals.
Oh, I think one of the reasons why I have really loved my job is because you have to wear a lot of hats in nonprofit, I think. And that's probably not a universal truth across nonprofit, but certainly in smaller organizations. The smaller your organization is, the more you need to be able to do a lot of different things, probably in whatever role you have, or at least have a good understanding of how those different things should work. So if you want to go into nonprofit and you know you're going to be working at a smaller nonprofit, I would say try to give yourself some versatility in what you know about and your skills. You know, having a super narrow focus and being really good at one thing is great. But in a nonprofit world, being pretty good at a lot of things is also great. So figuring out how you can, what are the things you're good at, and how can you get a little bit better at some of them to be able to contribute multiple types of skills to the team, I think is super important. And I think the more creative and versatile your team is, the more resilient it will be as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Y'all feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and yell them out too. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much again for joining us today. And Lindsey, thank you so much for sharing with us about Hands On Nashville. I've never heard of an organization like that before. I wasn't familiar with the other hands-on organizations. So I really appreciate you sharing about yours. I'm really impressed with all the work that y'all have done. Thanks again for everyone being here to learn more about this wonderful organization. And please go ahead and mark your calendars for March 24th, which will be the Nonprofit Affiliate Program's next educational program. And we are going to hear from Dr. Tyrone Freeman, who will join us to talk about Madam C.J. Walker and Black women's philanthropy during Jim Crow. So that should be a really great program as well. But just be on the lookout for an invitation to join that program. So that's all for today. Thanks again for taking the time to invest in our organization. And Lindsey, thank you so much for sharing everything with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. I'm staying just for a second to see if someone else asks another question. We're getting lots of thank yous. I think we're good.